Really. Wow. Hello, everyone. Source of strength, and creativity, and all kinds of positive and exciting developments. I want to thank Tarkan for that introduction. I remember his mother. And I've signed a lot of things over the years, not many purses. But I am delighted to be here in San Francisco with this great group of innovators and entrepreneurs, funders and inventors. I know that you heard from my former colleague in the Obama cabinet, Janet Napolitano, this morning, as well as a full array of top thinkers and doers. And I'm very pleased to be part of this conference. But I have to start by admitting I'm not an expert on software-defined storage or the intricacies of cloud computing. But I have learned enough to be tremendously excited about how the advances you are making are helping to build a 21st century American economy that is vibrant and dynamic, and if we make smart choices and investments, inclusive and broadly shared as well. I really love the motto for Nexenta, better living for a better world. That's a great mission statement. And it's a goal that I think we all should get behind. Now, of course, this is a global gathering, but I hope you'll forgive me if I focus on the American energy, the innovation, and the entrepreneurship that is in our DNA, and that despite our having gone through tough times, we always end up rising to the challenge. It's like that quote attributed to Winston Churchill, whether he said it or not, I love it, and that is the Americans always get around to doing the right thing after trying nearly everything else. We're in one of those periods right now, I think. But we do end up outworking, out-innovating, and out-competing. And I remember feeling that when I was growing up. I certainly remember it in the 90s when my husband was president. We were struggling to come out of another recession. Wages were flat, unemployment was up, the national debt had ballooned, jobs were being outsourced. Many wondered if America could ever be competitive again. But indeed, reports of America's decline were greatly exaggerated. Smart economic policies, the talent and determination of American workers, the internet revolution, first and foremost, helped the United States bounce back and achieve unprecedented growth during the 90s. And the power of the internet wasn't just the dot-coms, you know that so well. Yes, it was wonderful to see new companies creating jobs and boosting markets, but even more important were the productivity gains that computing and the internet brought to all kinds of industries that we wouldn't necessarily think of as being high-tech. That's what drove prosperity far beyond Silicon Valley or Route 128 or Austin or any other location where people were inventing and creating the future. And that's what advances like cloud computing are doing today, helping businesses operate more efficiently and effectively, better serving their own customers, but at the same time increasing productivity and profits and helping to drive our economic recovery. So we continue to need more transformative ideas like software-defined everything, more innovations that create industries that ripple out across the entire economy, indeed across the globe. We're seeing it, for example, with the revolution in domestic energy production that is helping to bring back manufacturing to the United States and making it cheaper for all kinds of companies to do business. And as you know so well, there are enormous opportunities ahead with so-called big data. Now that we have the processing power and tools to really analyze the mountains of data generated by life in the 21st century. And the United States is home to 1/3 of all data in the entire world. I think that's a major competitive advantage. We've already seen how the release of government GPS and weather data has helped to create new industries and given important tools to everybody from farmers to truckers. Now, McKinsey estimates that the productivity gains unlocked by big data could add hundreds of billions of dollars to our nation's GDP and help all businesses work better, cheaper, and faster. From streamlined supply chains and inventories to improved design and manufacturing processes and more efficient distribution and retail networks. The potential savings and improvements in the healthcare sector alone are staggering, and we're beginning to see some of those results. If you were interested, you might have seen the report recently about how the increased costs in Medicare seem to have slowed down and even begun to decrease, in part because of better use of data, more effective understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And under the Affordable Care Act, we're seeing some of the same results. Now, many technology companies here in the Bay Area are pioneering products and programs that can help us tackle some of our biggest challenges, from education to energy to healthcare and beyond. And if you think about how experts here in Silicon Valley helped fix the healthcare.gov rollout and put the Affordable Care Act back on the track, you can see the synergy. I mean, let's face it, our government is woefully, woefully behind in all of its policies that affect the use of technology. When I got to the State Department, it was still against the rules to let all Foreign Service officers have access to a BlackBerry. You couldn't have desktop computers when Colin Powell was there. Everything that you are taking advantage of, inventing and using, is still a generation or two behind when it comes to our government. So when people say, well, you know, look at that rollout, that was not done right, well, in part because the rules, the procurement rules, the technology rules that govern the federal government made it very difficult. There were other problems as well, and thankfully, you know, some of the folks here came in and got it straightened out. But going forward, government could use more of your expertise on the front end, designing and launching programs rather than coming in afterwards to help save them. Embracing a model of the classically American public-private partnership brings out the best of both worlds. That is what I tried to do at the State Department. It's at the heart of what we do every day at the Clinton Foundation that I joined when I left the State Department. It's what I hope we can do together in the years ahead. Because building a better America is a team sport, and we can't afford to leave anyone on the sidelines. In the high-tech community where you have so much to contribute, we need you in the game. And the good news is there are lots of reasons to be bullish on America. I believe we are better positioned than any other country to thrive in today's fast-changing world. We retain the best universities, the most innovative companies, the most creative, flexible, talented workers. And everything that I saw visiting 112 countries as Secretary of State convinced me that we have what it takes to solve our problems and renew the American dream for a new generation. That is the job ahead of us as a country. Now, before I sit down with Tarkan and answer his questions, I'd like to close with just a few additional thoughts. In this room, there is so much talent, there is so much expertise, there's so much accomplishment that it's maybe hard even to get your arms around the fact that we don't have to go very far from here to find communities where opportunity and upward mobility feel like distant memories. Because even with all of our advances and advantages, too many American families are losing ground and losing hope. Now, people are actually working harder than ever, but we've lost the historic link between productivity gains and wage gains that people can actually see in their paychecks and feel in their wallets. After all, healthy families and strong communities are what our country was built on. From the very beginning, Neighbors came together to help each other out, whether it was raising a barn or fighting a fire or taking up a collection for a wounded veteran or an orphan in need. They knew we were all in this together and that helping somebody wasn't only a nice thing to do, maybe charitable, maybe altruistic, but it actually rebounded to one's own self-interest. One of the early great observers of America, Alexis de Tocqueville, called that community spirit that he found here that he had never seen, certainly in old aristocratic Europe, he called that spirit our habits of the heart. And he said it is what makes our democratic experiment possible. I believe that is still true. A lot of hardworking families in America today are still hurting from the Great Recession. And communities are coming apart at the seams under grinding economic and social pressure. And for many, the American dream of opportunity and equality feels further and further out of reach. That's not the way it used to be. You can go back and look at the very earliest polling that was done nationally, starting in the Great Depression, which really was a terrible time for the vast majority of Americans. People never lost faith and hope in the future. They always believed that life would get better, and particularly for the next generation. Now, this summer, the eyes of our country, and indeed the world, have been focused on one community in the middle of the American heartland, Ferguson, Missouri. Watching the recent funeral for Michael Brown, as a mother, as a human being, my heart just broke for his family, because losing a child is every parent's greatest fear and an unimaginable loss. But I also grieve for that community and for many like it across our country. Behind the dramatic, terrible pictures on television are deep challenges that will be with them and with us long after the cameras move on. This is what happens when the bonds of trust and respect that hold any community together fray. Nobody wants to see our streets look like a war zone. Not in America. We are better than that. We saw our country's true character in the community leaders who came out to protest peacefully and worked to restrain violence. The young people who insisted on having their voices heard, and in the many decent and respectful law enforcement officers who showed what quality law enforcement looks like. Men and women who serve and protect their communities with courage and professionalism, who inspire trust rather than fear. We need more of that, because we can do better. We cannot ignore the inequities that persist in our justice system, inequities that undermine our most deeply held values of fairness and equality. Imagine what we would feel and what we would do if white drivers were 3 times as likely to be searched by police during a traffic stop as black drivers, instead of the other way around. If white offenders received prison sentences 10% longer than black offenders for the same crimes. If 1/3 of all white men, just look at this room and take 1/3, went to prison during their lifetime. Imagine that. That is the reality in the lives of so many of our fellow Americans and so many of the communities in which they live. I applaud President Obama for sending the Attorney General to Ferguson and demanding a thorough and speedy investigation. That's both appropriate and necessary to find out what happened, to see that justice is done, to help this community begin healing itself. And we should all add our voices to those who have come together in recent days to work for peace, justice, and reconciliation in Ferguson and beyond, to stand against violence and for the values that we cherish, we can do better. We can work to rebuild the bonds of trust from the ground up. It starts within families and communities. It was 51 years ago today that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called us to live out the true meaning of our creed, to make the dream real for all Americans. And that mission is as fiercely urgent today as when he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the hot August sun all those years ago. So we have a lot of work to do together. At Nexenta, you say better living for a better world. At the Clinton Foundation, we say we're all in this together. If you put those together, it comes out to a pretty good roadmap for the future. And we need all of you, your energy and your efforts, your innovation, your building, your creating, to help us achieve that better world. Thank you all for having me here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we all got all the questions answered already. So one thing I want to share very quick in these kind of conversations, people usually think these fireside chats, Q&As are all planted. We've done a lot of these things in the past. I'll absolutely assure you, the team said no pre-planned questions, everything ad hoc here. So which is amazing, and thank you for being free, open in this OpenSDx world.
Well, I'll see if I thank you at the end.
So on that note, one last point, the questions came not only from us, but from our customers,
Great.
partners, and employees. So a lot of great questions. So you said you want to talk about OpenStack and OpenSDx.
I will sit at your feet.
This is going to be my last interview with the secretary. So since this is a technology event, let's do a little bit of technology conversation from a e-governance and e-government perspective. You kind of touched on that. Mm-hmm. We have this Snowden effect going on right now. Mm-hmm. Technology vendors kind of scared, what does this mean to us? That Orwellian effect, 1984, who owns data? What's your thoughts about that with social media and everything else going on at the same time, security meets privacy?
Right. Well, it's a incredibly complex set of issues, and so let me just sort of take them bit by bit and quickly give some of my observations. I mean, I think you have to start, and I certainly start from the point that our privacy and our security are in a necessary, inevitable tension. In fact, that's gone back from the very beginning of our country moving forward. How do you maintain privacy, another word for it is liberty, while also having adequate security? Because without security, liberty and privacy may not be sustained anyway, and without privacy and liberty, the quality of life and the opportunity to pursue one's dreams may not be possible. So I start from the vantage point that this is a constant tension, and because we are now so much more advanced in what we can learn about people, not just in governments. The private sector holds far more information about individuals than the government does. It's just the way that business is done today. Then we have to keep striking the right balance. And I think what the president has begun to do and what the Congress is trying to do is something that I fully support. Moving from what we did in response to 9/11, which in many respects was just scrambling around trying to figure out how do we get information that protects us and protects our friends around the world. There's no doubt that we may have gone too far in a number of areas, and that those have to be rethought and we have to rebalance. On the other hand, we are living in a world in which a lot of bad actors have access to the technology that many of you have created, funded, utilized. So how do we strike that? And I guess my bottom line is we need to have a much more robust conversation with the American people, because I think this came as a surprise to many. I think it's fair to say that the government, the NSA, didn't, so far as we know, cross legal lines, but they came right up and sat on them. And when people understood that it could perhaps mean that their data was being collected in these gigantic, metadata configurations, that was somehow threatening. So I think we have to constantly be asking ourselves, we're going to have to take a hard look at what legal authorities we gave to the NSA and others, and make sure that people know what the trade-offs are. Just end with a quick example. We've had 2 Americans in the last week killed fighting for ISIS. Now, they're Americans. They're American citizens. And yet, what they are doing has at least indirect, if not potentially direct consequences for us here at home. So where do you draw the line, and how do you gather the information that can be useful to law enforcement, to other countries that are looking to try to contain what is a growing threat? These are hard questions, and I sat in a lot of meetings where we struggled to get the balance right. So let's have a robust debate. People need to be involved. And then finally, we need to make it clear to other countries that our technology companies are not part of our government, and that we have more legal process than any other country that I'm aware of that would ask for any information from a private company. I mean, probably the most frustrating part of this whole debate are countries acting like we're the only people in the world trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, every time I went to countries like China or Russia, I mean, we couldn't take our computers, we couldn't take our personal devices, we couldn't take anything off the plane because they're so good. They would penetrate them in a minute, less, a nanosecond. So we would take the batteries out, we'd leave them on the plane. So this is a competition. Eventually, at some point, and I know this may sound a little bit too hopeful, I think there needs to be a global compact about surveillance and about information and what it's used for. The United States government does not use information for commercial purposes. Other governments use information for commercial purposes. So we're just beginning to unpack this, and I think it's going to take some really thoughtful, careful work, but I am strongly in favor of making the case everywhere we go on behalf of American businesses so that you're not tarred with a brush you have no idea where it came from or why it's being used against you.
Very good. Time to technology. Just shift the conversation maybe to women in technology. It's obviously an area that as an industry we need to do better, and just to let you know, we're proud of the fact that at Nexenta, in our partner ecosystem in the room, you have a lot of senior leaders, and there are going to be more, all of them obviously as we move forward. What else can we do as government to accelerate that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a two-part question, because the government can do some things, like more STEM education, more encouragement for girls and women to get the education, to acquire the skills that they need to be competitive in the technology sector. But most of the solution rests with the private sector, with individual companies. And I can only tell you what my friends and acquaintances who are women in technology tell me. I have obviously no direct experience. But first, we've gone backwards. We had more women graduating with degrees in STEM subjects 30 years ago than we do today. Now, you have to ask yourself, we didn't have such fast evolution that girls and women decided they didn't want to do it. So what is happening? And there seems to be a kind of cultural bias or discouragement against girls and women. And therefore, I think companies, and some companies in the Valley and elsewhere are beginning to do this, you've got to get some good advice about how to recruit and retain quality, skilled women. I know, for example, Google has experimented with trying to figure out why when they post a job application, disproportionately, men apply for it. Well, I can tell you, I've been a woman for a long time, I can tell you that there is this difference between men and women. Have you noticed that? On a lot of things. But one of them is the self-evaluation. So you can have a highly qualified woman who doesn't think she's good enough. And in contrast, you can have a less qualified man who thinks he's perfect. So what Google began to do was to combine their job postings with personal outreach. I mean, I've hired a lot of young men and women over the course of my varied career and my law career, my NGO career, my public sector career, et cetera. And oftentimes women take convincing. I mean, very often the first thing you say, well, I'd like you to apply for this opportunity, or I'd like to give you this new level of responsibility. Almost the first thing you might hear is, you think I can? You really think I can? And the answer has to be yes. Come on, you can do this. Get out of your comfort zone, give this a try. So I think Google is now pairing outreach with job postings. That's a simple thing. Any company could do that.
Yeah.
And then I think you have to take a hard look at your culture. I grew up playing sports. I'm used to being, and then I ended up in politics, go figure. And so I'm used to being razzed and, having people, when I was a, young girl playing baseball, having people give me a hard time. You kind of grow up in that environment. But in some workplaces, it really is pretty brutal. And I think management has an opportunity to say, look, we're here to be productive, not to score points by driving people, to the ground. Come on, let's express ourselves differently. So I think there are things that the government can do. We have to do much more on STEM education. I was thrilled. There was a report today that a high school for math and science that Bill and I started back in Arkansas was ranked as like one of the best high schools in the country. Why did we do that? Because there were a lot of talented young men and young women in Arkansas whose school districts couldn't meet their intellectual needs when it came to math and science. So we started it more than 20 years ago. And so kids from all over the state could come. We need more government settings like that, more support for STEM teachers and STEM courses, and then the private sector needs to do its part too.
Super. How many foreign-born folks in the room? Can you raise your hand?
Oh, that's a good number.
So, staying on the technology topic, but immigration reform.
Yes.
And H-1B visas. What are your thoughts?
I think I rest my case with all the hands that went up. Look, we are a nation of immigrants, and if you look at the evidence as opposed to people's insecurities, which I take seriously, because if people are feeling a certain way, you've got to understand how to meet them there. But if you look at the evidence, I think the figures are pretty impressive. That I think it's like 40% of Fortune 500 companies have been started by immigrants. I think obviously the role that immigrants in technology play, as evidenced by your hands, is just unparalleled. I think that we are hurting ourselves by failing to do comprehensive immigration reform. And I know politically it's difficult because there are a lot of people in public office who hear only the loud voices that are on the negative side. And oftentimes it is out of a place of fear, not a place of understanding, or as I say, evidence. So I think that what we've got to do is keep making the case, but we need more voices. And the only point I would make to the tech community is on the H-1B visas. I support them. When I was a senator from New York, I supported them. But given the Great Recession and the fact that so many people lost jobs across the economy, including in the tech fields, there has to be an extra effort made to try to fill jobs with people who are already here. They can be either native-born or immigrant, but already here, so that then, if that's not possible, you have a good faith argument that you tried. Because too many people feel like the H-1B visas are, instead of an opportunity to get good, strong talent, a way of avoiding hiring American workers. So I do think there has to be some sensitivity to that, but I believe that's doable. I don't think that's an overwhelming task, and we have to just keep working for immigration reform. And in this upcoming midterm election, those of you who care about this issue, make it a voting issue. Make it an issue that you look at somebody's voting record. If they are not on the side of bringing it up for a vote, the bipartisan compromise that was reached in the Senate is about the best you can do in our own political world right now. And it was a good, decent bill. Not everything I would want, probably not everything you would want, but in terms of the political process working, the Senate came through, and it's just been an absolute gridlock in the House. So, we just have to keep making this a voting issue because that's what gets the attention of people in politics.
This is the music to our ears. I mean, many CEOs in the room, we really appreciate that. Turning to a little bit more to domestic policy before we talk about foreign policy a little bit. One area is obviously healthcare, Obamacare. You kind of talked about it with health.gov and everything else happening, technology side of things. What would you do differently?
Well, I have my own history on healthcare reform, and so I would be the first to stand up and applaud what the president accomplished, because it is very difficult to not only extend coverage, but to put in place mechanisms that will reward good care, penalize bad care, provide more transparency, move really toward electronic medical records, all the things that are in the Affordable Care Act. And I think as people kind of cut through mentally a lot of the argument and the negative advertising against the Affordable Care Act, they actually saw that it could help them and their families if they were not already insured. And it has in a number of ways. I mean, ending the prohibition or the, let's say, the exorbitant cost of being insured with a pre-existing condition is a very big deal for a lot of people. And making it possible for young people to stay on their parents' policies while they're in college, getting out of college, trying to find that first job has been taken advantage of by many, many families. So if you look at the pieces that are working in the Affordable Care Act, the many millions of people who are now getting insurance at a subsidized rate, but at least being able to have some choices, and people going on to Medicaid who are eligible, I think the overall result is positive. Now, as with any big legislative change, you have to constantly be honest enough to evaluate what's working, what's not working, what the costs are, what more has to be achieved. So from my perspective, I'm going to be looking carefully at the real data, not the scare tactics or the too positive, too negative. What's the real data? And you guys probably can help on that. And trying to figure out, what's the cost curve? What's the second year of costs going to be? What's it going to mean when small businesses have to be integrated into it? But this, for me, was a moral and an economic issue. I mean, I worked on healthcare reform for many years, starting in Arkansas, and then obviously during Bill's presidency, and then as a senator, trying to figure out what the right way to go was. And the stories of people who are unable to access healthcare are just wrong. I mean, that's just the bottom line. They're wrong. But it's also an economic issue. I mean, it does look like we may have stopped the trajectory of increasing medical expenses and overall healthcare costs, so that we at least have a fighting chance not to end up with more than 20% of our GDP going to healthcare, so much more than any other major industrial developed nation. So I think, Tarkan, that we have to be honest about what's working and what's not working, but let's stay committed to having a quality, affordable healthcare system for everybody, because it makes a huge difference in the lives of individuals. It makes a huge difference in the costs to the overall economy.
Absolutely. And as CEOs running companies, we share the sentiment on that because it impacts us as well as employers. On that note, one question on the economic side, because everything ties back to economy at the end of the day. On taxes, but this is a key angle to this, because there are a lot of companies here in the Valley. They have a lot of foreign earnings. And as you know, tax on repatriation of that foreign earnings is a big issue for us. Maybe not as much for startup companies, fast-moving companies like us, but larger companies. And some of the CEOs are in the room. These are public companies, some of them. What's your view on that?
Well, I would like to find a way to repatriate the overseas earnings. And I've read a really interesting proposal. I haven't vetted it, so I don't know all the details of it. But John Chambers and others of big companies, like you're saying, they basically have said, they would be willing to invest a percentage of their repatriated profits in an infrastructure bank that would be doing what we need to be doing to increasing our infrastructure, everything from repairing airports and ports and broadband access being increased dramatically, and a long list of what we're not doing. And I thought that was a really intriguing idea, because it doesn't do our economy any good to have this money parked somewhere else in the world, and it's not really being put to use there either. So I would like to figure out ways of getting it back. And figuring out some creative ways that, we repatriated foreign earnings once when I was senator, and the theory was that there'd be a very low tax rate. I think, as I recall, it was 5%, like 5.3 or something minimal. But then companies would be investing. They'd be investing in new plants, new equipment, new inventory, worker skills, the kinds of things that the economy needs and that these companies said they needed. And at the end of the day, a lot of them, just basically increased dividends or, bought back stock, stuff that is not, there's nothing wrong with it, but it tilted the balance too far away from what a lot of them had said they would do. So I'd like there to be a menu that people can choose from, and of course, dividends and stock buybacks could be part of it, but so would this broader economic investment, because there still is a lot of money that is just out there circulating, not being put to any productive use, even by companies here, let alone by other entities, including the government within the economy. So I would very much like to see us come up with some creative ideas. And this infrastructure idea really caught my attention. So I'm going to follow up on it. I just learned about it the other day and see whether there's something that could be done.
On the domestic policy, now this is more than a policy. I think this is near and dear to our hearts, as we are citizens on this beautiful country. And you read the news, you saw the news in Colorado, I think, 9-year-old, this automatic weapon and shoots the instructor at 9-year-old. Even scarier than that, you're reading the CNN, you're reading the Twitter today. The people commenting on this, why don't you give a semi-automatic rather than a full automatic weapon to a 9-year-old? They're discussing what type of weapon. I mean, they're like, maybe some of them are jokes, but joking all aside, it's a very sad moment. Gun control, obviously, what are your views on that?
Well, I very much supported what my husband did when he was president, which was to ban assault weapons and large magazines. And it was a very contentious debate. Some of you may have followed it. But it was part of a broader anti-crime initiative, including, police on the streets and, much more effort into community policing and the like. And I thought that it was a necessary part of that. It was a law that is what we call in Washington sunsetted, so it went out at the end of 10 years. And since then, there's been a concerted effort by the gun lobby to basically end all restrictions on guns. And I don't think that's what is called for under the Constitution. I think that there are a number of sensible steps that can and should be taken. This incident with the 9-year-old girl is just heartbreaking and horrifying. I mean, first of all, what 9-year-old little girl is strong enough to manage an Uzi submachine gun, which is apparently what it was? You know, the kick, the effort to control it. I mean, that's just the height of irresponsibility, to say nothing of the choice of letting your child do that. I think we need a much more concerted public effort to rein in the extremists on gun control. And one of the new claims that they're making is that blind people deserve to have their constitutional rights and deserve to have guns. And that you know, you kind of think to yourself, I mean, that's almost beyond imagination. And it's pushing and pushing and pushing because there's no pushback. And the pushback has to come from people, people who put sensible gun control measures on the ballot in states or cities and pass them, lawyers who take on what I think is a much too expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment. But this is not in line with any kind of understanding that I have about what responsible, sensible gun ownership means. I mean, I have no objection to responsible people, you know, if they want to have guns, if they want to own guns. But when you come to mental health, when you come to criminals, when you come to children, when you go down the line, it just doesn't add up anymore. So I think that we've got to have a sensible debate about what can be done and try to enlist people who are, like my husband, not afraid to stand up to the NRA. And yes, unfortunately, a lot of people lost their seats who voted with my husband, but they also got intimidated and didn't defend themselves as vigorously in some instances as they could have. And a lot who did defend themselves were able to survive politically. And you know, my husband and I went all over the country, you know, making the case. And I think we have to get back to having that sort of debate and isolating the extremists. And I unfortunately think a lot of the loudest voices are pretty much in that category.
So let's move the topic to the world arena, foreign affairs. You touched on a few themes earlier. I'm going to go through some of the regional areas and then I'll let you share your thoughts with us. Let's start with Middle East. I'm Turkish born. Obviously, in my country, there are a lot of change going on. I know you met with the Prime Minister now, just elected president. There's a new Prime Minister. There are a lot of things going on around Turkey, obviously in Iraq, in Syria. Thoughts, your views of today, and what do you think we should be doing as we move forward in the future?
Well, you know, I've published wrote this book that was published this summer called Hard Choices, and I am fully aware of all the hard choices that are having to be made in many countries. You know, you start with Turkey, but that would be the beginning of a very long list. In Turkey specifically, I write in the book, and I believe that under Prime Minister Erdogan, in his first 2 terms, Turkey made a lot of progress. The economy was unleashed, growth rate was high, there were a number of steps taken to end the military domination of the country, which in the past had resulted in coups and the like, which is not good for business, not good for stability. There were a lot of very positive efforts undertaken to respect different religions, particularly the Greek Orthodox Patriarch who resides in Istanbul, but also other religions in a obviously predominantly Muslim country. So I think and in fact in his, I think, second term, the Prime Minister was very involved in trying to negotiate a settlement between Israel and Syria. So when I became Secretary of State, and I had actually met the Prime Minister years earlier when he was the mayor of Istanbul, working with him, working with his foreign minister, Davutoglu, who's now the Prime Minister, was very productive. You know, we didn't obviously agree on everything. That's not the way 2 people or 2 nations necessarily can be, but we had a very constructive working relationship. I've been a little concerned, and I write about this in the book, that the Prime Minister, like so many leaders who really believe in their vision for their country, has become much more authoritarian in a way that is not good for Turkish democratic development and ultimately not necessarily good for the economy. And there's been a lot of efforts to crack down on journalists who didn't always agree with him, an effort to jail a huge group of military officers alleging a potential coup for which evidence was somewhat uneven, going after political opponents. Those are troubling signs. And I hope that now the president and the prime minister really take stock of what path Turkey was on and try to make sure it stays on that path. I love going to Turkey. I have Turkish friends. I love Turkish food. I mean, I'm just quite...
we have some of it at lunch later on.
Oh, good. I'm quite taken with the potential for Turkey's future, but I am worried about some of the trends I see right now.
Tying Turkey now to one of the neighbors, Iran, a lot of change there. New President Rouhani, since Ahmadinejad, a lot change. Different kind of a political structure. What's your views as we move forward with Iran?
Well, I think the most important thing going on with Iran right now is the nuclear negotiations that the United States and 5 other nations, the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, are engaged in. And I did a lot of work, as you can read in the book, and leading up to making that possible, first of all, by putting together an international coalition to have very tough enforceable sanctions targeting the oil and gas industry and other elements of the economy, which I think is the main reason why we're at the negotiating table, and one of the reasons why Rouhani won, because Ahmadinejad was such an obstacle to any kind of cooperation or any effort to try to resolve the nuclear situation. I don't know what's going to happen in the negotiations. I personally hope that there can be an enforceable, credible deal, but it really comes down to what the supreme leader, because Iran has this hybrid political system. They actually elect a president, but the real authority rests with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and it really comes down to what he thinks. And I think he's not made up his mind what he thinks. I mean, just a few months ago, he said that Iran needed 119,000 centrifuges for their peaceful nuclear program. That's absolutely not true. They don't. If they truly have a peaceful program, they need a very limited number of centrifuges to produce the medical isotopes and other peaceful purposes. So I think that debate is raging inside the Iranian government. The second thing is whether Iran will end its support for terrorism around the world. It's been preoccupied with Syria and now with the jihadi terrorists, ISIS, al-Nusra, other al-Qaeda offshoots in Syria because it's 100% backing Assad. And Iran has been the principal state supporter of terrorism and even going so far as to use their own agents and proxies. You probably don't remember this absurd story, which unfortunately was true, that they were trying to hire somebody to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And as luck would have it, the hitman they recruited out of a criminal cartel in Mexico was a double agent because he was a DEA informer. So that's how we found out about the plot. They were going to, if any of you have ever been in Washington, they were going to attack him at the Cafe Milano. It was just a bizarre plot, but it came from the highest reaches of the Revolutionary Guard Quds force inside Iran. And then the third thing I'd say is, the Iranian people are such an incredibly intelligent, culturally advanced people, and they live under this constant oppression. They can be hauled out of their homes, thrown in jail, they can be cut out of their profession if they speak out or in any way are independent of the conventional acceptable political line. So I don't know how long that is sustainable. So on all of these fronts, Iran remains a country of both great promise and great peril to itself and to the rest of us.
So a couple of the areas, moving from Middle East a little bit, two countries obviously uniquely important because of the size and impact. One is China with a new leader, Jinping, and obviously we have India with a new leader, Mukherjee. What your thoughts as two BRICS countries? Let's start with China, then move to India.
I think that's one of the most interesting questions because you know, you have a stark contrast. You know, you have China, which has made such extraordinary progress economically and deserves a lot of credit for lifting, you know, hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty, which has an economy that is, you know, still growing, maybe not as fast as it was, but enviably even now, and yet is facing internal political strains that are being addressed by Xi Jinping in a very direct way. Number one, he has this big anti-corruption campaign going on as a way of trying to demonstrate to Chinese businesses, Chinese activists, that he's not going to tolerate what has become, you know, very open, very large corrupt activities by party members and their families. So that sends a strong message. How it's followed through on is not yet clear because it's just begun. They also have a problem about how they keep growth up. I mean, how do you keep growing at the rate you've been growing when you are still operating what is largely a state-controlled economy? And so state-owned enterprises that are politically controlled have to show their contributions. Are they giving you accurate information? They're not transparent, at least not to the rest of the world. So really, what's going on in the economy, and how does he get a handle on that and try to slowly kind of loosen the grip of what are state enterprises as opposed to market enterprises? That's a huge problem. And then controlling what's going on locally, because so many of the local political leadership, party leadership, are, you know, very corrupt and very impervious to change even from Beijing. In fact, one of the things that I found as I did a lot of work in China, and not just with the government, but with activists, business leaders, dissidents, is that so many of them out in local areas thought if they could only get their story told in Beijing, the central government would respond, because they still believed that the leadership in Beijing was looking out for the best interests of the entire country, as opposed to local leaders who often were quite abusive and not necessarily fulfilling any kind of public mission. So I think the internal political and economic strains within China are being addressed, and I think it's a huge undertaking. And I think we all want Xi Jinping to be successful in making sure that the economy keeps raising living standards, that people feel they have a stake in the future, but also to begin opening up a little bit, because at a certain point, you got to have the kind of creativity, outside the box thinking that all of you do on a regular basis. Now contrast that with India, where it's a miracle that this huge sprawling democracy actually works and has worked for many decades. They have one of the best electoral systems in the world because it's totally nonpartisan. The way India runs its elections is just astonishing. And you know, you have hundreds of millions of people voting, and they accept the results, even when it's not to their liking, because of the way the elections are held. I used to kid them and say, you know, when the BJP was defeated by the Congress Party, you know, 10 plus years ago, people were surprised, but they accepted it. And that was about the same time we were having our problems in our 2000 presidential election. And I kept saying, you know, the Indians need to come over here and run our election so that people will accept the outcome because they'll know that it's, you know, totally nonpartisan. So you've got to give India credit for doing something that is truly hard, running a democracy. Now they've got to figure out how to run an economy. And they have to run an economy that is going to provide increased living standards for a huge part of the world's poorest people. If you look at poverty levels around the world, yes, sub-Saharan Africa has huge numbers, parts of Asia, but India has so many really poor people who lack basic hygiene and sanitation, who lack adequate food and medical care and education. Yes, they have a middle class now of 300 million people, about the size of our own country, but there's such a huge drop-off to the rest of India. And I think what Modi is trying to do is somewhat modeled on what he did in Gujarat, which was to try to open up the economy. I mean, every time I went to India, I argued for opening up the economy. But the politics were so tied to special interests. So the idea that you would open it up to international retail was just a bridge too far for many Indian politicians. That you would invest in infrastructure and actually get your return and not have it go into corruption. So he has, and from what I'm hearing, he has really begun to implement or try to implement basic economic reforms. His challenge and the challenge that he has to meet is whether he overcomes the unfortunate history of Gujarat and the horrific attacks on Muslims that were not checked by the government that he ran. And it's why the Bush administration wouldn't give him a visa, because we could never figure out exactly what happened. He's been legitimately elected. He's running a great country. He has an agenda, but he must be inclusive. Because if you look at the patchwork of the Indian nation, languages, ethnic groups, tribal groups, castes, you look at it, it is a recipe for combustion. If people feel that their political system is not inclusive. So I'm hopeful on both counts that both China and India address their own internal challenges, and we'll wait and see how that plays out.
So from that dimension, let's move to our lightning round. I'll tell you, some of the people in the room are crazy. They're asking a lot of questions. So I'm going to go through this list very quickly.
Okay.
The first one is not a crazy question, it's a normal question I would ask. Thank you for asking that question. Midterm elections, any predictions?
Well,
maybe that's a crazy question, scratch that.
No, it's not a crazy question. I mean, it's really going to kick off after Labor Day. I mean, everybody's been working and maneuvering and raising money and making their case and all the rest of it. It will not surprise you to hear me say that I am going to do what I can in the September, October, early November period to try to help get Democrats elected and reelected, because I don't think that defaulting on your debt and a government shutdown and not passing immigration and not trying to find ways to work together are good for the country. So I'm going to do what I can to make sure that we don't lose the Senate and that we try to maintain a decent balance in the House.
The next. A lot of fancier.
Well,
For sure.
I think people are acting in their self-interest.
Yeah. Since we're getting close to lunch, what's your most favorite food?
Well, as you can tell, I have a lot of favorite foods. I really do. I mean, I like all kinds of ethnic cuisines. I do like Turkish and Middle East. I like Indian. I like Chinese. I mean, we could go down a long list. I could cover the planet because I've eaten practically everything that you can imagine. But I suppose if you were to ask me, like, what would I want for my last meal, it would be like all American. It would probably be pizza and cheeseburgers and French fries, and, all of that.
Love it. Small pleasures. Favorite drink?
Alcoholic or non-alcoholic?
We are in an OpenSDx summit. You go however you want.
Oh, water, definitely water.
Your favorite book? There are many of them on the tables, by the way. I'm not going to tell you which one.
Oh, yeah. No, not. I've answered this question in the past, and it's my favorite book because it had such a big impact on me when I read it as a young woman, and now I am rereading it, and that's Brothers Karamazov. I just found it so consuming when I read it as a young woman, and I'm going to reread it and see how I feel about it now.
Oh my God, very good. Your favorite music band of all time?
Of all times, the Beatles.
Oh, we love you.
I mean, I have a lot of favorites. But oh my gosh, more than half of you were not alive then. But watching the Ed Sullivan Show with my friends when the Beatles came to the United States,
amazing.
It was a transformative moment, and we all had our favorite Beatle. And it was, it was just unlike anything we'd ever seen or heard. Now it seems sort of old hat, and everybody has moved on, but it still gives me an incredible delight.
Favorite movie of all time?
Favorite movie of all times? Wizard of Oz.
Nice.
I love that movie.
Favorite TV show of all times?
Ooh, wow. Well, I've watched so much TV over so many years. How about my favorite now, Downton Abbey? Okay.
Very good. Favorite TV or radio host of all times aside Rush Limbaugh?
Funny, on my list of a million or so, he wouldn't be on that. Again, I now have gotten to know a lot of the people who are our hosts over the years, and I like them for different reasons. Obviously, there are some incredibly successful people that I can go back in time and think about. But in more recent years, people like Oprah and Ellen DeGeneres, and I loved their style and I loved their attitude. So.
This is the last question that everybody is waiting to ask. You're so unique. We're all geeks in the room, all Silicon Valley. We cannot come up with another question, but this is the question everybody's waiting to ask. Boy or girl?
Oh!
You got them.
I have to tell you, I don't know because my daughter and her husband don't want to know. So they have tried very hard not to find out. When they do the ultrasound, I think they have their heads over their ears and their eyes. So we don't know. So we're going to be surprised, like the old days, and meet this new arrival and welcome him or her into the world.
I'll tell you, my fiance is a nurse practitioner. She's Google searching all day long. She's doing this remote sonogram. She's trying to find out. I had to ask. So on that note. So lovely. Oh, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being part of this amazing group. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all very, very much.